Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to Home Education Matters. And today I'm doing a group podcast on teaching your child to read, because I know as a home educator, this was something that I found quite daunting, was something that I didn't really remember myself when I was younger. So I didn't really remember the process, whereas perhaps with learning subjects when you're a little bit older, you can kind of remember how you learned them. But learning to read, I don't remember. I suspect I was chanting, cat, bat, hat in a classroom of 40 people. But I do remember teaching my daughter to read, and she's dyslexic. And it was a bit of a challenge, I have to say. My son taught himself to read at 2 using Mr. Men books. So he was my first child. And I honestly thought teaching your child to read would be a doddle, because he basically taught himself and I just took all the credit. My daughter, who came along a year and a half later, that was a bit harder. And we used Peter and Jane books, which is like a very old-fashioned kind of approach where you learn just a number of words. And then I think once you know a baseline of words, you're okay. Something like that. We didn't do phonics. We tried phonics, but it didn't work. And so I thought it'd be interesting, because I know that teaching your child to read is one of those where there's a slight schism, I think, in how you approach it. So I thought I would get 3 experts in to talk to us about how we can teach our child to read, or help our child learn to read when we're home educating, because sometimes it can feel quite an isolating process. So first of all, I would like to say hello to all of my lovely guests. And then I'm going to get you all to tell us something about yourself, like who you are, everything we need to know about you, summed up in 2 sentences. So that's a good challenge. And as you're all like kind of, English bods, I'm guessing you're going to be very good at summarizing things. So we're going to go in this order: Jen, Harriet, and David. Go for it. Jen, you first.
Hi, I'm Jen. I run The Primary Educator. I was a primary teacher for years, and now I help parents at home by teaching the 6 pillars of reading, which is a variety of things, including phonics, but other things as well to support children in learning to read.
Hi, I'm Harriet. I'm an erstwhile home educator. Our children are big and grown up now and gone off to do other things. And I am now a senior lecturer in early childhood at Liverpool Hope University. And I've got a special interest in learning to read, and I've done research into home educating families, children learning to read.
Hi, I'm David. I am a former teacher, primary school teacher. I was English lead a number of schools during my 10 years. And now I'm a children's book writer and illustrator.
So, David, you went from teaching to writing children's books. Now, as somebody who trained as a teacher and did a little bit of teaching, I gave up the profession about as quickly as it was humanly possible for me to do. So you stayed at it for longer, but what do you think is the main challenge of going from teaching to something where you're, much more freelance and creative?
I'm like 6 days into that career, so I will. I'll give you. I left Friday. Last Friday was my last day of teaching, so I've just jumped into the unknown. Effectively, I'm doing a bit of tutoring as well, so I'm hoping that it's going to take off. I've been writing, and I've got 2 books out already, but I'm just at the beginnings of now trying to sort of focus on that and move away from the classroom.
Do you find that having young children yourself helps you to sort of know the kind of books that you would like to write? Because I know my children were very picky about the books they liked when they were younger. Yes.
My first book, The Imagination Thief, the idea from that came from my stepdaughter. She had this idea of, why do adults lose their imagination? Does someone steal it? This kind of idea of somebody stealing adults' imagination. So I turned it into a book. I gave her credit. Didn't give her any money, but I gave her some credit.
In actual fact, I can answer her question for you, because in actual fact, the thing that steals adults' imagination is school. As a home educator, I can safely say that's what steals the imagination, because I have a 15 and a 17-year-old, and they both still do kind of imaginary play and engage in weird creative games together, because they've never been to school, so they've just never had it kind of imposed out of them. I think school has this delineation, doesn't it, between playtime and learning time. And so as a result, children learn that maybe play isn't as important, and you have to hear a bell in order to be able to go and do it. So I would maybe write a book about that. There you are, David. That's your next book idea.
There we go.
See how popular that one is.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jen, you mentioned that you cover the 6 pillars of reading.
Yes.
Now I don't know what they are. Do tell us.
So most people talk about the 5 pillars of reading. So you might have heard of that one before. I actually include the 6th because I am early years trained. That's where I started. That's where I'm really passionate. So I include communication as the first pillar. So oral fluency and communication. Then the second one is phonemic awareness, which is your listening and blending skills. Then phonics, which is the knowledge core. So understanding which letter makes which sound. Then the 4th one is vocabulary. The 5th one is reading fluency. So those are the words you might not be able to sound out, and also speeding up so that you have the ability to do the 6th pillar, which is comprehension. And I very firmly believe that in order to raise a child who is able to be a really confident reader, you have to be able to do all 6 areas. So in school, certainly in the school I taught in, we did all of those, but they weren't called that. So we did like phonics, and phonics was the core, particularly in year 1, where, it was just about reading words and knowing all the sounds, but then you'd have guided reading where you'd really focus on the other things. And I find that when you are educating a child, it's really important that they have the understanding of all 6 pillars, because so often you find that one area is they struggle with more, and then that massively impacts all the others. So while I do teach phonics, and I love phonics personally, I think it's a really great way to learn and I'm saying that as a dyslexic myself, I found learning to read using phonics a lot easier than learning to read how we used to read. But it is only one part of the whole, and you have to have the whole in order to support our kids to become really confident readers.
These 6 pillars run concurrently.
Yes.
So you would be concentrating. So you're basically, if you were building a building with 6 pillars, you'd be building them all up at the same time. You wouldn't do one pillar, then the next pillar. So
it's a bit interesting, because obviously if you're focusing right down at the bottom end, so right down at, 2-year-olds, you would expect them to be able to do communication, phonemic awareness and vocabulary and comprehension, but not necessarily the phonics and the fluency, because they require as I say, they're knowledge based. So I don't know if you've come across the concept of skills based and knowledge based before. There's the 4 pillars that are skills that you can learn at any time and build at any time, and then there's the 2 pillars that are knowledge, so they build upon each other. So for example, when you're learning to read, if we break it down just to phonics and phonemic awareness, the phonemic awareness is the skill of being able to put sounds together in order to make words, and phonics is this knowledge of what letters make what sounds. So
no, it's interesting, because my impression of phonics was now what you've defined as phonemic awareness, which was what I thought, when you take chunks of sounds and then sort of like fit them all together like jigsaw puzzles once you learn what those sounds are.
No, so, or the way that I would support it and the way that I would teach it is that phonemic awareness is the listening skill. So that tends to be what dyslexic children find particularly tricky unless they have a lot of support with. Coming from my own background, coming from, I do a lot of dyslexic support. And it's making sense of the sounds in your head so that they fit together. So if I'm saying to you, cat, and you're putting that together in your head as cat, that's phonemic awareness. That's not phonics. Phonics is, when you break it right down to the pillars, is literally knowing that the letter C makes the sound k. So it becomes really, really defined into, phonemic awareness is the skill of being able to put the sounds together, and phonics being the letters themselves. So what I tend to find when I'm working with parents is I give out loads of phonemic awareness games, and I get parents being like, but this isn't going to teach my child to read because it doesn't have any words in it. Like, we're not reading any letters. And I have to explain that your child will learn to read by playing these really active games that don't require books. They don't require sitting down inside. A lot of them I love playing outside, because you're training your child's brain and your child's ears to hear smaller and smaller units of sound and to manipulate them. so that when they then come to put the knowledge side of it, so the letters themselves, into the structure that they've already built, it just becomes easy. And then by having this really strong phonemic awareness early on, you then prevent what we tend to see in year one, which is this difficulty with things like adjacent consonants, where children who can read k, ap, for example, cap, can't read k, l, ap, because they can't put the two adjacent consonants next to each other. So they'll end up saying cap or lap rather than clap. And that's again because their phonemic awareness isn't quite strong enough in order to put all of those sounds together. So that's why I teach all 6 pillars, and I teach vocabulary as well, because it'll help children to have a sort of basis to work from. They can use another skill to support them with that reading. And the same with comprehension. If you're reading a sentence and it says, the boy his hands, they're not going to read the boy cap his hands, because it doesn't make sense. So what could that word be? So by using all 6, you are supporting all of those different things. So if you have an area where you do find harder, like phonemic awareness if you're dyslexic, or phonics if you have memory issues, or attention issues or anything like that, all of the other pillars do continue to support. But they do come in, you can teach some much earlier than others because they are skill-based rather than knowledge-based.
And is this 6 pillars approach, or the 5 pillars that you've added a pillar onto, is this the standard school approach, primary approach? Oh, okay, it isn't. Okay, so one thing you were mentioning there when you talked about phonics is, I know when I was at school, which was a long time ago, that we learned our alphabet A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all that kind of jazz, right? And capital A, big letter A, little letter A. And now it's abacada, and that's the phonics. That's where the phonics has come in, right? Okay, so Harriet, I've got a question for you as our kind of resident theoretician, I'm guessing, just because you're in academia, so I'm going to give you that title, regardless of whether you want it or not. Was there a shift in academia that went from learning kind of whole words, which I think was how I used to do it, to learning to read through phonics? And was it backed up with scientific research that said this is the best way to do it?
Yeah, that's pretty much what happened. It was designated the reading wars, and it was kind of a sort of a standoff between the 2 approaches, of the phonics approach on one hand and the whole word approach on the other hand. And yes, it's based on it's based on what you might call scientific testing of reading skills through phonics. There's a book called, I've struggled to remember the guy's name. It's a bad science book about those tests that seriously critiques the basis on which phonics is predicated, that science that's underpinned it. That's the kind of a be that as it may situation now, because as we know, reading has become the teaching of phonics in various different forms in school.
Oh, that's interesting. Is it possible that actually we made this move to phonics based on slightly ropey science, and now we're here, we're just kind of, it's all built into our system now, so we're this is where we are?
It's very much entrenched into our system. And it's very much entrenched into commercial interests as well. So the next scheme, the next thing, I think it's read, write, ink in schools at the moment, is earning somebody tremendous amounts of money.
Everyone has something they want to say about read, write, ink. And actually, I have to say, this is taking a slightly controversial turn. Jen, you go first, then David.
Thank you. I do just want to add on to that, as someone who is currently in schools. It's not just read, write, ink anymore. There has been a big shift very recently that a lot of phonics teachers are very cross about, into all schools are required to hold a scheme. So read, write, ink used to be a thing. I have certain difficulties with read, write, ink because it's very prescriptive. What most schools are required to do now under Ofsted is to have a phonics scheme in order to prove that phonics is being taught structurally across all teachers, which is very good for new young teachers who do not understand how to teach phonics, or teachers who've come from higher up the school who haven't done it before, but is very prescriptive and limiting for those of us that have dedicated our lives to doing this and are really, really passionate about phonics. And I have found for myself, even though we chose a scheme that works best for our school out of all the ones that we had the option of, I have found it to be quite frustrating because I'm not necessarily allowed to support the children in the way that I know works for my kids in my class, because it doesn't follow the scheme.
Okay, Harriet, you had a little thing to say then, David.
I was literally going to say the same thing that Jen just said, but I was Key Stage 1 lead when they did this big swing to getting schools to have a scheme in place. And it was kind of like, oh, well, you don't have to do this, but it was pressure, it looks better if you have got this. So I looked at about, 8 different schemes, because we didn't have a scheme at the school I was working at. And they were all so soulless. It was very difficult for me to kind of go, oh, let's go with this one. And we were Ofsteded as we were kind of moving away from our own system to developing a system, because the head teacher was very keen to get something in place to sort of get rid of any of the stress or worry about being checked on it. And it was just, yeah, I say it was very soul destroying to see the sort of the way it's done. It's not adaptable. It's you're constantly looking at it thinking, oh, children with any sort of as I was working in a school that had children with hearing impairment, and there's no provision for that kind of thing with any of these schemes. There's no consideration. It's just, oh, everyone will learn like this. That's fine. It's very, yeah. So backing up Jen, basically, it's very frustrating.
Harriet?
So the book that I was trying to remember is called Misreading Reading, The Bad Science That Hurts Children. It's by Gerald Coles. It came out in 2000. But I would also really like to talk about some of the research that I've done with home educating families and how their children learn to read.
Let's actually move towards that, because one thing I wanted to say in response to David is that this the frustration of the kind of one size fits all approach when it comes to learning to read and everything else in schools is probably one of the main things that pushes people towards home education. And it was really interesting when both David and Jen, you were both talking then about the limitations of this kind of approach, not being able to be flexible, not being able to be responsive. And of course, as a home educator, this is like one of the most glorious things, because I don't know any of these theories. I knew that there was a bit of kerfuffle about phonics. That's literally all I knew. And yet my 2 children, I taught them both to read, although theoretically my son did kind of teach himself, but I just did what felt intuitively right. Now, I bought Chip and Kipper books, which I think are phonics, hated them. My daughter hated them. I hated them. We just hated them. So I bought a job lot of Peter and Jane books from eBay for like £10, and we worked our way through them. And then by the time we got to about book 4, I just thought, do you know what? I'm just going to give her some Cressida Cowell books. So I just chucked some Cressida Cowell books on her bed at night. 6 weeks later, she's reading because she wanted to read the books. Now, you can't do that approach in schools, right? That's really a different sort of thing. So, Harriet, you were mentioning about home education. So tell us a little bit about your perspective as a home educating parent, and then also, obviously, as somebody who is studying the art of learning to read.
So I had an experience not dissimilar to your own, although our daughter was older. She was a lovely child to learn to home educate on. She was interested in books. She liked being read to. She could recognise her own name. Sometimes she'd want to write something down and I'd write it down and she would copy it. So I knew that she knew little bits and pieces about reading and writing. There was no way in my head that those things added up to make a whole. I didn't teach her. When she was just approaching 6, she got given a book. She got given Hop on Pop by Dr. Seuss. She, as far as I knew, had never read anything before in her life. It's a very simple, and as it happens, phonics reader. She took it off and read it by herself. She never asked me any questions. She never asked me to help her. When she'd read it, she carried this book. She loved this book. She carried it round with her for a good couple of weeks. She constantly had her head in it. When she sort of finally had enough of it, she went and put it back on the bookshelf, helped herself to something else, went off and read that. She had never had a reading lesson, and I had no idea how she had done what she did.
That is a really common experience in home education, isn't it? That you basically leave your child just to expose them to things, and then by the time they get to about 6 or 7, do you know what? They're surrounded by all these books. They want to give it a go, and they do it in their own time. Harriet, do you find that there's some sort of kind of backing for this? For this approach? I know it's popular in home ed, but it obviously in the school system that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, I was so mind blown about what had happened and trying to understand what had happened that I did my PhD on it. And my research covered 400 children, 311 families. It just so happens that I was mugging up before this is my book. Before we started the podcast, to refresh myself. And I mean, we've touched on a lot of things that came out of the research anyway. Your experiences, my experiences, you say, this happens a lot. And understanding how that happens was something that I was and am really interested in. A good proportion of the home educating families say that they do use phonics, more or less, a little bit like you're talking about, Eleanor, little bit of this, little bit of that. We're bored with that now. She's not that interested in this. Let's try something else. That looks interesting. So not particularly approaching learning to read through a method, but rather through life, through interest, with a heavy emphasis on individuality and flexibility. There were other families where experiences were so different that it really necessitates going back, that trying to understand how some children just simply seem to pick up reading, just seems to happen. Trying to understand that goes back to questioning a lot of our assumptions about reading, including what people are doing when they are reading, what that actual act of reading consists of, and whether everybody reads in the same way. And including thinking about the philosophical and metaphorical basis of how we understand reading. And I'm really happy to talk about those things if you'd like me to.
I would love to do another podcast on that, actually, because I love reading. I immerse myself in reading. I've always loved it from a very young age. And when my children were very tiny, tiny babies, I knew that one of the values that I wanted in our home was I wanted both my children to enjoy reading as much as I enjoy reading. Because to me, as a new mother of 2 young children, very close in age, it was important that I got time to sit and read because it was really integral to me. So I thought, well, if I teach them to read quietly, they'll read quietly while I read quietly, and then I get what I want and I get reading children. And for me, reading is an immersive, hugely pleasurable experience. For other people that I know, they have to kind of book it in. They're like, okay, I'm going to do half an hour in bed before I go to sleep. And then, okay, I've done my half an hour. I'm going to put my book down. I cannot read like that. Reading to me is one of those that it's like, it just keeps going on and on. I just want more and more of it. It's actually quite difficult for me to pull myself away from reading. And so it's interesting what you said, Harriet, about people, maybe they experience reading in a really different way. So I would love to do another podcast on that. However, I have a number of questions that actually came from that. I think my main question that I wanted to ask, perhaps the 2 teachers, although David, I know you've jumped ship, but we'll call you a teacher for now because I don't think term is up yet. So I think you're still officially one. Sorry about that. So, oh no, it is. It was up on Friday, wasn't it? No, there you are. You're gone. But one question I have for both of you is, do you think, listening to what Harriet said about, when her child was sort of 6, she just kind of almost found herself sort of able to read, or, had the motivation to be able to learn herself. Do you think that we are pushing reading too early in schools? And is that because we have these kind of Ofsted milestones and we need to, we want some children, like my son, he learned to read very, very young. My daughter learned to read when she was nearer 5. Is it because we want to try to kind of homogenize the event? So I'm actually going to ask David, then Jen, what you think about that.
I think in many ways it really depends upon the child that you're dealing with. I mean, we've got my eldest stepdaughter is autistic, and she was homeschooled until she was about 6, I think it was, and she just picked up reading just like that. She just picked up books. She was fine with it. I've got 2 boys who they don't live with me. They've been in school their entire lives. They're still probably not ready to picking up some books. They don't really read a lot of fiction. They read a lot of non-fiction. And that's the thing that doesn't. You have to kind of base it on that and interests and things like that. School never really accommodated for the various different fixations that Erin, my eldest stepdaughter's got. She's always been sort of forced within a reading scheme, those sort of things. So I think it vastly depends. I think one of the big things within the schooling system is the fact that the curriculum's it's overstuffed. It's massive, particularly Key Stage 1 curriculum is massive. And there's not enough time for me spent actually just sitting, reading, talking about books. Writing's thrust on children far too early. So you don't get a chance to really enjoy it. If I was to have a magic wand and completely change the school curriculum, I would take away all the expectations for children to be doing any sort of noting of anything down. They would just be enjoying books, doing drama based on it, listening to people, listening to expert readers talk about books, and building up all that lovely language internally, first of all.
That's interesting, because there is definitely that link in the school system between reading and writing. It's like the two, is it the 3 R's,
Yeah.
reading, writing, arithmetic? And there's no doubt that we inextricably link reading and writing. And for children that don't like writing, which actually is pretty much most children until they get to a certain age, it's very difficult then for them to take out that love of reading. Jen, what do you think? Do you think we are expecting children to read too young?
So I have quite a divided opinion on this, just in my own head, because I have taught a huge range of kids. As I say, I'm very much EYFS year 1. And I know there's a lot of kids who, as soon as they get that sort of click of reading, they fly and they just want to read all the time. They need that support to be able to get there. And I wouldn't want them to have to hold off on another couple of years on another, decision from outside of themselves. But equally, I do think there are some children who would benefit more from a more active style of education, perhaps. I do agree with what David said about writing too early. It would be incredible if I could have, a class of 30 where the expectation in year 1 is that we don't start writing. If they want to write, fantastic, but we focus on reading, because while I can see why people might find it very tricky when their children don't want to read, if we had more time in the school system to support that reading through games and through activities. And I don't know if you guys, I know Dave, you will, but like phase 1 phonics is in reception, and that's the phonemic awareness, and that's pretty much all kids get of that. And it's done within the first half term and onto something else, which is then what causes a lot of children in year 1 to find reading tricky. So if we spent all of reception building up those listening skills, those communication skills, which I know it says in the curriculum we should, but practically I'm not sure many schools have time. And I am being quite careful with this, because I know that some schools spend a lot of time on it, and I know that some schools have the chance to, but I know that mine doesn't have that opportunity because of the expectation that's put on them. But I personally love teaching reading to young kids. I see young kids who are even younger than school age who really, really want to learn to read. And I'm lucky enough that I know that the kids that I support enjoy what I teach them. So, we get a lot of kids have that amazing light bulb moment in year 1 where they are like, oh, I can read now. And then they go to the book corner and they pick up any book that they want. And we have a very good system in my school where, yes, okay, we have the phonics readers. They take home 2 phonics readers a week, and they take home 3 library books. And those library books are anything they want to choose. And that, I think, it comes back to those 6 pillars, that good balance of engaging children with books as well as teaching them to read. And I'm not a massive fan of phonics readers. I think particularly early on, they can kill a love of reading. But if you
are the Chip and the Kipper ones, Biff, Chip, Kipper,
they're not the only ones. They're not the only ones. There's a huge range. And in fact, I've recently come across a school that's, the books you were talking about. I've come across a school using those as phonics books. So
they're
they
brilliant.
are technically
they're actually quite good stories. And one thing, however, I wanted to ask is, I have a theory. Now, I'm a home educator. I'm also a trained teacher. So I wouldn't say I have a foot in both camps, because I really, really don't. I'm very firmly in the home education camp. But I have a theory, and a lot of my theories about school are deeply cynical, but I have a theory that the reason we teach children to read quite young in schools is because the sooner we've got a classroom of 30 children who can read, the sooner we can sit them down quietly at desks and reading books. Harriet, okay, you're a fellow home educator. Back me up on this cynical view.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that came out of the research is the wide variety of ages, the age range in which home educated children learn to read. So in my cohort of 400 children, the youngest was 18 months old and the oldest was 16. Now, that is a huge window compared to the window of a couple of years that you get in school. And I said earlier that I didn't think that reading was necessarily the same for everybody who does it. And learning to read changes as children get older. So one of the issues in school, and I think you're absolutely right, if you are not reading by standard when you finish primary school, your educational outlook is extremely bleak. You are extremely unlikely, a child is extremely unlikely to ever make up that ground. It's very, very serious. Many of the children in the cohort in which I conducted the research learnt to read age 10, 11, 12, 13, an age which would be disastrous in the school system, but which was absolutely fine at home. Part of the reason for that is that learning to read at home does not hold back the rest of your education, the rest of a child's education, the way that it does in school. So as one father put it to us, there's the verbal, the visual, and the hands-on. Children are learning all the time through those mediums. They are not reliant on the written word in the way that school children are. And the other thing is that when children did start reading, they brought to reading an enormous richness of vocabulary, of grammar, of genre, of understanding of the uses of the written word, of conversation, of narrative, all sorts of things that they brought to reading. They didn't get those things out of reading. They brought them to reading because they had been read to, because they'd watched TV, because they'd had lots of conversations, discussions with adults, with their peers, lots of life experience of their own, and they were bringing those things to reading. So when they started reading, they were starting in a very different place from a 3-year-old learning phonics in a nursery setting.
And that's interesting what you say, because Jen also sort of said a similar thing, but in a very different format, which was that if a child wants to learn to read, they can want to learn to read at 3, they can want to learn to read at 7. Now, I suppose my question to you, David, is, do you think that we should teach reading? Or do you think that actually if a child wants to learn to read, they would just learn to read? If they're 3, they want to learn to read, they're motivated, they'll learn to read. Or do you think children actually need systematic teaching for how to learn to read?
I think I'll sit on the fence again. I think it vastly varies with the different people that I've encountered. I'll give you one example, though. I had a child a couple of years ago who was English as a second language, very young for his age, and found reading challenging. He didn't find phonics enjoyable and things like that. So, and one of the biggest problems we had with him was that he wouldn't sit still for 5 seconds. He was all over the place, bouncing all over the place, things like that. And I found an app called Teach My Monster to Read. I don't know if anyone's encountered that before. It's really good. And he loved that. And his progress leapt. It shot through because he loved using things like that. It was gamified. It followed a plot, everything else like that. It was systematic. You went through levels. You had different things. It's kind of like finding the thing that sparks them. I'll give an example of my kids as well. Like, as I say, the girls are kind of dotted in and out with homeschooling and mainstream school, but the boys haven't. And my sons love reading the football books, the ones about Jamie Vardy books and things like that. Now, if you gave my sons a writing task to say write a football commentary for a game, they would come out with the language that would amaze you. If you told them to write a Harry Potter style story, they'd have no clue where to start because they haven't embedded any of that into their mind. So it really does. I personally think that the problem with back to moan about schools again.
Feel free. It's a home education podcast. Keep going.
You've got 30 children. And in a lesson, if I've got 30 kids in my class, at best, I've got maybe 40 seconds with each child. When you take out all the other things, the inputs, the behavior issues, interruptions, you've got maybe 40 seconds with each child. And that's not an ideal place where you can really tailor an education system to a child in that situation. It's not possible. You're going to end up with having to fall back onto systematic programs and schemes and things like that work it in a way that you can teach 30 children at the same time. Whereas if you're in a home education situation, you can really tailor it. You can build on their interest. You can go to the library and pick up the books that they want to read. You can go and pick out the activities that are going to work with your particular child. And that's why I think my house, you've got maybe a control system because you've got the boys who have always been in school and the girls that haven't. The girls' love of reading is way more. And I know there's always boys tend to dislike reading and, in comparison to girls anyway, but the difference in my house in terms of the love of reading is huge.
I think in actual fact, one thing I would say is that I think once boys hit a certain age, it's not that they don't like reading. It's exactly what you say. They don't like reading fiction books, or some boys like to make that shift towards nonfiction. My son, who used to read a huge amount, he got to about 7 or 8, and he seemed to just stop. He still liked it, but it wasn't quite as instinctive as it used to be. And then I realized that he was actually reading textbooks, and he'd enjoyed reading textbooks. I mean, he would literally go to bed with like GCSE economics textbooks. And then, so I started buying him lots of nonfiction books, adult nonfiction books. And that was it. He was flying, and now he reads lots and lots of nonfiction books and some fiction books. But we needed that freedom and flexibility to be able to tailor it to him. And that's one of the beauties of home education. But Jen, I want to ask you then, as a primary teacher, do you think that we need to teach children to read? Because I feel personally that we don't. Now, I'm sensing that you're going to feel that we do. So I would like your opinion on that.
So before I start that, I know this is a podcast, so no one can see me nodding the entire way through everything David just said. But the reason I really rate homeschooling, and I think it is a wonderful thing to do, is that whole connection between the teacher, in inverted commas, and the student. Like, you have so much more time to support your kids. And over COVID, when we had half classes, that for me was revelationary, because I had 12 kids in my class, and I could suddenly follow their what they wanted to do a huge amount more. And that was so empowering for me as a teacher. And I just wanted to put that in there, because I was nodding all the way through everything David was saying about like being able to support kids' interest and following all of that. But I know no one could see me on a podcast. So with the teaching kids to read thing, I only had a small thing that I wanted to say on that. And it does come from my own experience as a dyslexic child, because I was desperate to learn to read. I was the kid that was constantly bothering my parents to read to me. I just wanted another story at bedtime. I was constantly picking up books, and I was constantly looking through them. And I was really struggling to read. And obviously this is before phonics was brought into schools. I was on the Biff, Chip and Kipper books. I quite enjoyed them. They were the magic key ones. But it was still the learn words method. And I was brought out of classes, and I was put in all these interventions, and I was very aware that I couldn't read. And I really struggled with it. And my mum could see me get feeling worse and worse about it. And she ended up actually teaching me phonics. And because she taught me phonics, and she very specifically went down to the basics of what sound does that letter make, I learned to read. So I'm speaking from my personal experience as a child who needed to be taught. So I know that there are children that need to be taught. I'm sure there are children.
I think the distinction I'm making is that, when you mentioned about writing and what David was saying about sort of this pressure to write, and you said, wouldn't it be lovely if we didn't teach writing in year 1, but children who did want to write came to us? Yep. Now, that's what I'm suggesting for reading, that children who do want to learn come to you and learn to read. And if they don't, there's just no pressure to do it. Would that be an approach that would work in the school system?
It would be incredible if that could happen. Unfortunately, no, it wouldn't work in the school system. I will explain why very quickly. What really, really frustrates me in the school system is that once you hit Key Stage 2, so I know, Harriet, you were saying about if you leave primary school unable to read, you're screwed. I agree with that. Unfortunately, it actually is even earlier than that. If your child leaves Key Stage 1 unable to read, good luck. because we don't continue that phonics teaching. I can see David nodding at me. We don't continue that phonics teaching into year 3, into year 4, into year 5. So children who find it hard, who may come to it later, don't get that. And as a teacher, that breaks my heart, because I want every child to have that opportunity. I want every child to be able to read. And it puts a lot of pressure on teachers. I know, like, this homeschooling podcast, but I do just want to come at it from the teacher perspective of, it's a lot of pressure to feel like if my children leave my classroom not able to read, then I failed them. And that really is the feeling that I get. And that's really hard to do, which is why I've moved into this, the primary educator section of supporting homeschoolers and supporting parents outside of the classroom. Because, as David said, if I want to read with every child in my class, I get maybe 10 minutes a week to do so. And that's, with me as a teacher who is so passionate about reading, I would do nothing but read all day if I could. I still only get 10 minutes a day. And that's where, even if you're not home educating, parents are so important, because you have the time to follow your child's interests, to read the books you want to with them and support them at home. So I do agree with you. That is a massive failing of our education system, is that the children don't have the opportunity to come to you to learn to read later on.
That's astonishing, isn't it? Because in actual fact, if you look at the school system, one of the things that I find kind of frustrating is that the same things cycle round and around the school system. Like the water cycle, you learn the water cycle early on, you learn the water cycle key stage 2, you learn the water cycle key stage 3, you learn the water cycle key stage 4, and you just basically go a little bit deeper. It's like the hermeneutical circle. You get a little bit deeper every single time until you're so bored of the water cycle. There's actually Lemony Snicket, he did the series of unfortunate events. In one of the books, he actually, all through the book, there is this in joke about how boring the water cycle is, because it's all you ever hear about in schools. And it's true, you just go round and around the water cycle. Now, why is it then that they don't allow, let's do a bit more learning to read, let's do a bit more learning to read? You'd think they could actually add that in, because that is how the school system is based. Let's just keep going around, churning around the same stuff. Jen?
So I can't explain exactly why we don't continue to do things as we would earlier, but I can say we do continue to support reading. We do a huge amount of guided reading. That continues all the way up. What stops is this systematic teaching of phonics. And that's where, I know not everyone loves phonics, not everyone likes it, but we do see really good results with phonics. We just do. It was brought in 2012, and the literacy rate has risen since then. But what frustrates me is that phonics isn't continued to be taught higher up. And I understand that for kids who can read, that could be frustrating. And the truth is, we just don't have the budget, and we just don't have the support there to do the interventions that you need to do. Because if you have, let's say, 3 children in a class, I think the average is 5 children in a class leave Key Stage 2 not at expected standard. Leave Key Stage 1 at not at expected standard even. If you have 5 children in a class who need to be taken out for an intervention, they need another teacher to do that. They need a highly trained phonics teacher to do that, who would need to be paid, who would need to be supported. It doesn't tend to be in the budget. And what I find incredibly frustrating about school, and I'm sure David does as well, is the budget just is never there. You're constantly, every time you reach out for something and you say, this child could really do with a dyslexia assessment, for example, or another intervention, it's like, well, we don't have the budget for that. And you're like, okay.
I hear exactly what you mean about the budget, but surely if learning to read is that vital, that if you don't learn by the time you're Key Stage 2, you're left. Basically, you'll have to pick it up yourself. Good luck, buddy. You'd think it would be a priority over some of the things that the budget is currently spent on. But anyway, that is my last moan about the school system. So, Harriet, did you have something you wanted to sort of chime in on there?
I did. What came out of, one of the things that came out of the reading research was that very often children would start reading, they'd make a little bit of progress to begin with, and then that progress would plateau. So as we've said, that plateau is incredibly important in school. And as Jen describes, a child who's plateauing, you throw everything that you can at them. You've got a closing window. You've got to make it happen. In the home education scenario, child loses interest, maybe is finding it a bit difficult, wants to go and do something else, has got bored with this and got interested in something else. those children might go off. They might not do anything more that looks like reading for months, maybe even sometimes for years. When they come back to reading eventually, as they eventually will, they have improved, very often exponentially, without that kind of focused input. Obviously, they're in a literate environment, and that culture of literacy is all around them in their family and in their environment, but there has not been any deliberate teaching. And whatever it was that held them back has gone. That barrier has gone. So I think in the home education scenario, where you have that kind of time, some of these difficulties or problems, they simply dissolve. And honestly, it's not rocket science to say, you know, something that, I don't know, a 6-year-old might find difficult or boring or pointless, a child of 9 or 10 finds easy, interesting, and meaningful. And all you've got to do is give it that time.
So if we were to take it from a home education perspective, and a couple of you have referenced the reading wars, right? So this phonics versus whole word thing. Now, obviously, as home educators, we can choose which approach we take. Now, is there, if you were to assume that, obviously, I suspect that you're all going to say, particularly you, David, I suspect you're all going to say that it depends on the child, and I get that. However, a lot of people who maybe have just started home educating, maybe their child has been in nursery, but then they're, you know, from age 5, they're going to start, you know, from compulsory school age, they're often running home educating. They may not have a clue where to start when it comes to teaching their child to read. Is there an approach that you would each recommend trying first to see how that would go? David, what would your sort of initial sort of suggestion be to a home educating parent of, say, a 5-year-old who doesn't really know how to read, maybe knows their letter sound, something like that?
With when I first met my now wife, she was home educating fully with Erin and my little one Jemima, and I was NQT, sort of had no idea what homeschooling was like, and I was expecting, you know, feral children and all sorts of different things, because I'd had all sorts of different things drilled into me. One of the things that she did well, and we built on when we first met, was just having an environment that is just words everywhere. You know, on the walls there's words attached to things. You know, she had things like labels on drawers, for example. You know, this is the cutlery drawer. So then the children are seeing the word cutlery. You know, they've constantly got the words all around them. Little tricks like putting the subtitles on the telly if you're watching something, and putting the subtitles on. Playing board games, like we constantly play. I've got a massive cupboard of board games downstairs that have just got. They're all word heavy games. There's little trick games. There's a caveman game, which is particularly fun, which gets you to think about syllables, and you can only use 3 syllables to explain yourself, and that sort of thing. It's just you can tailor the environment that you're in your home to have so much vocabulary around you all the time that it just becomes confusing. My little one, who she's going to possibly be homeschooled. We're trying to find out where we sit with new work and my changing of career, but she's only 3 and she's picked up words just because they're around all the time. So she recognizes the word nursery because she sees it all the time. She recognizes the word paw because she loves Paw Patrol. So she doesn't necessarily, she's already got those advantages. The phonics isn't necessarily there, but she knows some words already and is starting to associate the fact that words have meaning, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
So your sort of suggestion would be that you expose your child to literacy just around the house. And actually, that's actually the approach to learning a language as well, isn't it? I know when my son was learning German, you would put Post-it notes in German, and you would watch German programs with subtitles. And actually, very, very similar approach, because I guess they are learning a language, right? In that way.
Yeah.
So you would sort of expose your child to literacy in their kind of everyday way. So Harriet, what about you? What would you say for a home educating parent of, say, a 5-year-old, and they want to start teaching their child to read, but they don't really know how to go about it? What would you recommend?
Okay, so I think one of the things that was really, really interesting about the research was, 400 children, 400 different ways of learning to read, 400 different experiences. And we treat learning to read in education as if it is a very difficult skill that has to be acquired, that has to be taught, that consists of stages, all the 6 pillars, or whatever people want to call it, of bringing those things together, as if this is a very precise a very precise thing that has to be very carefully engineered to be successful. And I think one of the conclusions from the research that I did was actually it's the opposite of that. Learning to read is easy. It is not difficult. We're continually surrounded by literacy. We live a lifestyle, we have a culture of literacy. Sure, stick labels around the house if that makes you happy, but our world is full of labels anyway. Lots of parents talked about going out and doing things like reading car registration numbers as they walked up and down the street. This stuff is all around us anywhere. And there were so many diverse, imaginative, different ways of learning to read, and lots of experiences. They were not structured. They weren't carefully, concertedly cultivated. They just happened. Really nice, quick story about 2 little boys learning to read. Their dad said they were really big fans of a children's singing group called the Wiggles. I don't know if you've heard of the Wiggles, I think that dates you too. But the boys loved the Wiggles. They used to spend loads of time listening to Wiggles tapes, singing along, watching the videos, dancing, knew all the words to the songs. One day, one of the boys asked his dad if he would write out the words of the songs for them. So the dad did. He typed them up, put them in a folder, gave it to the boys. They already knew what the words were. They knew all the songs by heart. All they had to do was work out the one-to-one correlation. Now, there was once they could do that, they could read. That was the start of them reading. And they went off to become fully fledged readers through that, sort of just by chance. Nobody had said to them, you need to listen to the Wiggles songs, you need to learn those words, that's how you're going to learn to read. When did you last watch the video? Let's put it on now. Come on, I can't hear you singing along. That would have been nonsense, and yet that's how they learn to read. So my advice to home educating families would be, do whatever your child is interested in, have fun, enjoy yourselves. There will be words there. You can look out for them if you want to, but if you don't, they will still be there. Your child's not reading, give it 6 months. If they're still not reading, give it another 6 months.
It's interesting you say that, because that's pretty much how my son taught himself to read. We were living in Egypt, and there was not a bookshop, and we got a box set of Little Miss books from the local school's car boot sale. And we had 3 or 4 Julia Donaldson that my mum DHL'd out to us. And we read these same books, because we always read 3 books every night, 3 books every nap time. That was a lot of reading of the same books again and again. So within about 6 months, my son had memorized, obviously, all the books, because he just read, he'd had them read to him so often that he would just sit there, and because he knew all the words, because I had read them to him, he could then piece them together on the page. So it's actually a very similar approach, Harriet, to the one you mentioned. So Harriet, your advice would be, just let them absorb it. They will find it and come to it in their own time. Okay, so Jen, what about you then? You come at it from obviously necessarily you're in the school system. It is quite a structured approach. So what would be your advice to a home educating parent of a 5-year-old? What would be the first things that you would say? Look, try this out, try that out.
So it's really interesting listening to both of you guys, because obviously, a language-rich environment is exactly what we do in school. Everything is labelled, everything is covered in words. So I would 100% support that. And I would 100% support the point things out in the world, because I actually actively teach that to homeschooling parents, is raise that value of reading. Show your child why it is so important that they learn to read by pointing out things. Because I think what happens quite a lot is that we read for our kids, and we don't exactly point out to them, oh, we're going to Cafe Nero. How do I know that? Because it says it on the sign. And I think for a lot of kids, particularly if they become reluctant later on, it's because they don't really get the why of reading. And so by pointing out to our children, we have to read, it's everywhere. Like just looking around this room, I can see so many words. And if you look, if you walk down the street, you can see so many words. So I completely agree with Harriet as well about pointing out words, explaining them, engaging with that reading. I am going to give a little plug to phonics, and I'm going to explain why. The difference between recognizing individual words and phonics is that if you know a certain amount of phonics, you know a certain amount of words, and it becomes bigger. Every new sound you learn, the more words you can read and the more words you can work out independently. So while it's great, the Wiggles concert and the songs, and that's amazing, they know all of those words now because they've got that written down. That's incredible. And then they have to have all that comprehension and that support within their own brains to work out new words because they know a certain number. And that's fantastic. But if you have the sounds and the phonemic awareness to put them together, they can work those words out without context, without having to use other things. So I do back phonics because I really like being able to see children. And obviously I know I'm in a school environment. I know I'm not homeschooling, but I do support a lot of homeschooling parents. And it's amazing seeing children make huge progress as they add more sounds into their knowledge base. Because to begin with, you start by reading words like sat and sit and tap. And they're very basic. But just by adding another letter, you're then reading ink and loads of other words. That it expands over time by introducing new sounds. And you can then essentially give a child a 5-syllable word that they're never going to work out from context, and they sound it out. And I certainly still do that today if I'm reading something medical or some sort of assessment. And I would put money on the fact that you guys all do. You don't just recognize a new word that you've never come across before, and you're not just able to read it. You use your phonics. And so by supporting our kids to do that really basically, and I'm not saying, okay, your 3-year-old has to sit down and learn all their letters and know all their letters. Absolutely do it at your child's pace. I always say, you know your kids better than anyone else in the world. And if you feel it's the right time, fantastic. If you feel it's not the right time, fantastic, because that's the beauty of homeschooling. You have the right to do all of that. But I do think phonics has something to offer your child in the form of independence, because you're not just learning word on word on word. You're once you know phonics, you can give it a go at doing absolutely anything else, as long as you have the other 5 pillars to support you as well.
Okay, so Jen, you're a phonics girl. I can safely say I'm a whole word girl, because I found that my daughter, for example, she used the Peter and Jane books, and then what happened is, instead of having to use her phonics to encounter unfamiliar words, she would just gauge what they were from the context and learn them that way. So that's how she tended to approach it.
That works.
So David, what about you? Are you a phonics in the reading wars? What side are you on? Are you on phonics or are you on whole word? I feel like you're going to say you're between the two. Are you? Is that what you're going to say?
I think I was very much the early part of phonics. I get frustrated with it when it starts to get into a long time since I've taught phonics, but there's sort of like the alternative sounds, and the later on in the phase, sort of 3-4, the children have to know a lot of the terminology that goes alongside it. So they've got to know that's a split digraph, and they've got to know this is a die, and that sort of thing. And that part of it I found frustrating. I think I agree with Jen on the fact that even as an adult, if I encounter a new word, I will break it down into syllable sections, and I will use phonetic knowledge of working that out. But where I found it frustrating teaching was when I was getting into that alternative. I remember my son, he failed the year 1 phonic check, whatever that means. It didn't mean a lot for him in the long run, but he knew split digraphs, he knew all the terminology, but he really struggled with the actual putting it together and the blending part of it. But he knew all the terminology, and I was like, well, how the teacher spent ages teaching him all these lovely language of it, but didn't actually focus on the actual teaching of it. I remember him sitting there once, and Jemima was winding him up, and she was going, his name's James, and she was going, James, that's your name, and he's like, no, I've got a split digraph, to his voice, so he's getting frustrated, but that didn't mean anything to him. It was just a terminology that he'd been picked up, and that's the sort of thing. So when I read a lot of Michael Rosen is very heavily anti-phonics, and I read a lot of his posts, and a lot of it makes sense. Sometimes I disagree with what he's saying, but there is a, you do need a degree of it, but it's just the extent that they go with it in primary school, it just becomes like noise. And the same thing that if I was being anecdotal with schools, the children that do well with phonics are often the children that have a lot of reading at home with their parents, and the ones that don't do well
anyway, wouldn't they?
And exactly, you've got an argument for whether or not that you're making a difference, or it's just the fact that this child's been exposed to a lot of books. But you do certainly need some of that early understanding. It's just those last, I think it's where it gets to phase 4 that I get frustrated.
I just want to support what David said around, it comes back to what I was saying right at the beginning of phonemic awareness versus phonics and the skill versus the knowledge. And I do agree with what David says, when you get to phase 5, because that's when you get the not adjacent consonants, the alternative sounds in, there's so much effort on learning those new sounds and recognizing split digraphs that a lot of that phonemic awareness that is phase 1, that should be, as I said, all the way through reception, we should be focusing on that so much more. And that tends to get lost, particularly if you're not that aware of it. But yeah, I just wanted to say that it's so important we teach those skills of listening, those skills of blending the sounds together, because that's the true part of reading. And then the phonics is just the knowledge. So I just wanted to bring it back to, that's exactly what I was saying at the beginning.
It's fascinating that the two of you mention that when you encounter a new word, you break it down into phonetic chunks. And that's obviously what I do. That's what everybody does when they encounter a new word. And I wasn't taught phonics at school. It's just how we do it, right? That's how we do it as humans. I don't think we can say that phonics at school does that. Harriet, what would you like to say?
So the reading researcher Frank Smith asserts that phonics is something that you can do when you can read. Phonics isn't something that helps you read. It's something that you can do when you can read.
Interesting. Jen, what do you say to that?
I want to reverse that and say that by therefore teaching our children phonics early, we support their reading the whole way through. Because you're right, we know how to do phonics once we're adults because we can read. But by supporting our children to know the sounds first, we can speed up their reading so that they get that love of reading, that enjoyment really early on.
David?
I'm going to go off on a tangent slightly. Another thing that you'll probably do is, because when I was teaching, to say to everyone in the school, you are expert readers. You have picked up tactics that you're not even aware that you have picked up over the course of being exposed to word. And a lot of teachers at the schools that I've worked out weren't taught under a phonic system. But one of the things that you do as an expert reader is that you make associations with parts of a word based on the what's the word for it? I always forget this one. The etymology of the word. So a classic one would be if you see PSCY together, you'd think you know the sound that makes because you know it makes that sound in other words. So that another thing, that you pick that up as you go as well, I think.
So maybe if we all learnt Latin at the same time, we would all be we'd all be fluent readers. Harriet, what do you think?
Underpinning all of this is a philosophical assumption that writing is speech in material form, and that totally underpins any theory of phonics. There is evidence to suggest that some young children don't see written words like that, and I can give you some research illustrations of that. If a young child is being taught phonics but doesn't understand the written word as speech in material form, the phonics teaching is not going to make any sense to them.
What do they see it as instead then?
Direct symbolic representation of whatever it is that's written down.
Okay, slightly lost me there, but
like a picture would be.
Okay.
Like a picture would be. So if you've got a picture of an elephant, that's a representation of an elephant. It doesn't somehow say elephant. It is a direct representation of the elephant.
Like a hieroglyph.
Yeah. Or the little icons that you see on computers all the time, or road signs, or figures. Like the number 3 doesn't say 3, it represents 3.
Like an emoji. So you'd have a laughing emoji, but it doesn't actually read the word laugh. Wow, I did not realize that some people see it like that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So, and there is evidence that at least some young children see the written word as a direct representation of the thing that word represents, without the speech link in between. So in that case, phonics doesn't make any sense.
Okay, so Harriet, in the reading wars, I'm guessing you're not on the phonics side. Are you on the whole word side, or are you sort of somewhere in the middle?
I'm not on a method side. I think, I think learning to read is, as I say, the assumption that we're all doing the same thing, that reading is a process, that it's all based on the same philosophy and the same way of seeing the world, that we all want to get the same things out of reading, because clearly we don't. All affects how we might approach it. And, when I came away from the reading research, I was so blown over by the imagination, the diversity, the flexibility, the resourcefulness of the home educating families that, keep going back to, as Jen said, you know your child best. You know what's fun, you know what they're going to enjoy, you know what's going to make them feel good, you know what's meaningful and relevant in their lives. That's all you need to know. Obviously, we've got very strong cultural emphasis on phonics, and it's almost impossible to consider learning to read without considering phonics. But lots of the other things that people can do that become ways into literacy, we don't know very much about them at all. And home educating families are using them all the time, coming across them for themselves, adapting them, going with them. And it's a bit like the rainforest, It's all happening out there. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep playing with it. If you've got time, if you've got space, if you've got flexibility, that's all you need. That's all you need.
I often feel that home educators really are at the kind of vanguard of a lot of these educational approaches, because we have the freedom to try things out. We quite often really are leading the way in a lot of these approaches, like things like a project-based learning. I mean, home educators have been doing that for decades. It's ridiculous that it's now like a thing. Let's try this in schools. It seems to work. And you think we've all been doing this for a very long time. So I wanted to ask you each one last thing before we finish, which is that David mentioned earlier about an app, learning to read with your monster or something like that, right? Now, I loved using apps with my children when they were young for learning to read. We used Squeebles for spelling. I could record my own voice saying the spelling words that we were doing. I based it on the books that they were currently reading. So I knew that they were being exposed to particularly difficult words in whatever books. We were reading Harry Potter at the time. And so I would put those in for Squeebles. So I love learning to read apps. I think they're really helpful. My dyslexic daughter, we did something called Letter Quest, which is when you basically have to take a bunch of letters and then make as long a word as you can from it. And what I would do with her is we would look at the letters. I would say the word that I wanted her, and then she had the letters available. She just had to put them all in the right place. It was very good for her spelling and super fun. We got spells, we could kill zombies. It was brilliant. So I would like each of yours top tip for like a favorite resource. It doesn't necessarily have to be an app. It can be a book, or it can be a game or anything like that. But what is each of your kind of favorite resource for helping a child to read? Who would like to go first with that one?
So I have a few. I just want to shout out the Top Marks website, because it's free and it's got loads of games, and I've used it in my teaching and I've used it with kids as well. But it's great. Topmarks.com. Just go and have a look, because there's a whole load of free games for a huge range of different ages, etc., etc. This is not sponsored, just something I like. Otherwise, Vocabulary Ninja is really good for vocab. They tend to do like new vocabulary words each week, which I find really useful, because I obviously, as soon as you say, oh, use a new word this week, my brain just loses all words that have ever existed. So I find them quite useful to think of new words to incorporate with my kids. But I would actually say my favourite resource for supporting any sort of reading, any sort of writing, is chalk and water. So go outside, write some letters or some words or whatever you feel like. Some hopscotch is great. Onto the pavement, and then give your child a pot of water and a paintbrush, or a spray bottle and a paintbrush. There's so many things that you can just do with chalk and water that relate to both reading and writing and loads of other things as well. So basic resource that I always have to have is chalk and water.
And what's great about that, I think, is that it takes out that perfectionism that some children really feel overwhelmed by when it's pen and paper. They see something, they write it, they have to cross it out, and then they hate it and they think their book is messy. Because we used a lot of sand trays and flour trays and sugar trays, if you really want to lick your fingers afterwards, and to format our letters. David, what about you? What sort of resource or game or approach do you think is like a really good one to recommend?
So I've already mentioned Teach My Monster to Read, which is, I think it's free on a browser, possibly have a charge on an iPad and things like that. But Teach Monster to Read is really good. The girls grew up with Reading Eggs, which is very, very good as well. But my thing in our home, because as I say, my sons are a bit reluctant to read, but if we play board games and they have to do a bit of reading, then they find it more fun. So we love board games. So I grew up with Dungeons and Dragons and Warhammer and that sort of thing. So I've tried to get them into it, and we play a lot of different board games. The one they currently love is something called One Night Werewolf or something like that, where you've got to kind of deceive people, and they're a bit older. So that's more of an older one, I think. Castle Panic's a great one. There's all sorts of different ones that you can find, and it just encourages vocabulary and talking and reading and that sort of thing.
We did a podcast recently about Dungeons and Dragons, and the guy pretty much said, he said, that's fine if you want to play, but you're going to have to read. And it's amazing the impetus that in actual fact, I know an unschooler whose son learnt to read purely from playing Dungeons and Dragons and Minecraft. Harriet, what do you think? What would you recommend as your sort of top resource?
Well, just to follow on from what David's been saying and you've been saying, lots of children in the research learnt to read playing games on the computer or Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! And it was, as David was saying, it was being involved with the game, being with their friends and playing the game that mattered to them, not learning to read. That was kind of incidental to the other action. So, and kind of in the same spirit of that, I'm going to sort of cop out and say, use your imagination, use the world around you. Reading's not all about reading. Reading is not all about letters and writing. It's about experiences. It's about what you do in your life. It's about how you have fun. It's about the conversations that you have. It's about the ideas that you bounce around. All of those things make reading meaningful. So go and do some of those things. Whatever, go and live.
That is home education all over, isn't it? Okay, so Jen, David and Harriet will be in our Facebook group, and so they will be putting links for their own businesses so people can find them if you've listened to this and you've thought, my God, I really need this person to tutor my child, or if you just want to reach out and go, what was that resource you mentioned again? So all three of our guests will be in our Facebook group. But I would like to thank David, Harriet and Jen very much for coming on the podcast today. It was really fun and actually like much more controversial than I thought, which is always like my favorite kind of podcast. I love those. They're a dream for me, controversial podcasts. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been lovely to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thanks for having me. Lovely.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Lovely conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.